hands of their enemies as slaves. When Roman soldiers poured through the broken walls of Masada, they were greeted only by the silence of death. In 1963, almost 2,000 years later, Israel undertook an ambitious excavation at the flat-top rock of Masada. What they found appeared to match Josephus Flavius's description in uncanny detail. Today, however, Masada is once again under siege. Some scholars question the story of the Zealots' last desperate hours, where they ask, are the bodies of the 900? Or is the tale of the mass suicide nothing more than the hackneyed literary device of an ancient historian? In fact, did it happen at all?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the Rock of Masada, which is a very important page in the book of history which called Israel. If we are talking about heroism in this book, this is the spot and this is the page. I would like to go with you back around 2,100 years ago. King Herod took the road that we did today, and when he came to the foot of Masada, he said to himself, I'm going to change this place into my winter resort.
At what has become one of the most visited tourist sites in the world, guides tell the story of the Zealots' last stand and their self-sacrifice as historical fact.
And when the Romans arrived to the top, they found here food storages full with food, water cistern full with water, and 960 hero dead bodies laying around here, left this world as free people, not as Roman slaves.
Dani Bahat is not your average visitor at Masada. He is a veteran archaeologist who took part in the 1963 excavation.
The place is so dear to me that I refrain from coming here. I'm today here for the first time after 7 years. The idea is, further from the eyes, the more further we go, it becomes more sublime.
Perhaps at no other archaeological site in the world has the tension between the sublime and the real played itself out more dramatically than at Masada. Here, in an unprecedented fusion of myth and archaeology, the story of Masada took on a life of its own, a life that had to do more with modern-day Israel than the siege of 2,000 years ago. When the young state of Israel needed a symbol of national pride, the call to excavate Masada enticed hundreds of volunteers from around the world. What they found would not only excite archaeologists, but would create something of a national shrine for Israel.
It became our national pilgrimage, since we saw it in the last link which connects our country, or our people to our country. And we, of course, wanted to renew that link. We went every year on a pilgrimage, all the youth movements, and everyone used to come to Masada.
In October 1963, the stronghold was laid open down to the foundations, this time by the archaeologists. A giant mission of exploration supported by volunteers from 29 different countries, headed by Professor Yigal Yadin.
Yadin, former head of the Israeli Defense Forces and the most celebrated archaeologist in Israel, orchestrated the enormous undertaking at Masada. He had a mission which had worldwide attention.
Well, for a long time we have been the people of the book living in the land of the book. Then for 2,000 years we have been the people of the book without the land. Now, for the first time after 2,000 years, we are again living in the land of the book. My aim is, I would say, to live again as the people of the book in the land of the book.
They began their assault on the mountain in the scorching desert in 1963. The excavation became, next to the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of the most publicized digs of the 20th century. It was a very exciting time for young Israeli archaeologists like Gideon Förster.
And one can remember the very great excitement we had coming into the field, starting our work on an unknown country,
the hundreds, thousands of volunteers who took part in the unfolding of the history of Masada. This was a site that was actually some kind of a national site. It was a national hope by everyone to be able to work on this site, which was very difficult to excavate because of it's so far away from any other center. We had, of course, a lot of information, particularly from Josephus, and we were very eager to see if our expectations were to be fulfilled.
In contrast to the painstaking tedium of an ordinary dig, Masada yielded up important finds daily, sometimes hourly.
Things turn up every day. Every day. It's not that kind of site where you dig for weeks and weeks until you find something. It's loaded with finds. This was the greatest time of my life.
Charred beams and blackened stones testified to a great conflagration. Biblical scrolls and a synagogue spoke of Jewish occupants. Catapult stones and Roman period arrowheads told of the intensity of the siege. But it was the human remains that spoke most poignantly to the archaeologists. Amnon Ben-Tur remembers.
And I think one of the most exciting days of my life, not just professional life, but in general, was when I was working in the northern palace of Masada and digging in the little bath of the northern palace. Under meters of ashes and collapsed debris, we uncovered the remains of 3 people, man, woman, and a youngster. The clothes, the sandals, the hair, the blood on the stairs, well, it was not red, but brown or black. Here are the people who perished on the last night of Masada. And you can actually, you do actually touch them. And I don't think that there can be many moments in one's life that are more exciting than this. It was really exciting.
Another 24 bodies were found in a cave on the southern side of the mountain fortress. But it was Dani Bahat who would make an astounding find.
A few yards from here away, that's the first which I found with my own hands, the 11 shards which bear names, amongst them one who was the commander of Masada, Ben Yair. The other names were on the shards were names which were kind of friendly names, like the fat man, the man from the valley of Jezreel, the man with the rounded hair, the curly hair, Joab, the fisher, and these are the ones I can recall now, and Ben Yair, of course. If this is not exciting, I don't know what excitement means. But you suddenly feel that you have abridged those 2,000 years and you are making a continuity. And this is the appeal of Masada.
But there was something profoundly unorthodox in the way archaeology was conducted in the heady days of those excavations. In 1965, Israel was a nation that felt surrounded, pressured from many sides, and the Masada story had obvious resonance. Neil Silberman, an archaeologist trained in Israel, is a long-time observer of the uneasy mix of politics and archaeology.
The excavations of Masada must not be seen as a normal archaeological excavation or scientific experiment in which rival scientific hypotheses are being tested. It was instead, under the direction of Yadin, something of public performance art.
A national pageant with an entire nation for an audience, with the entire world looking on. Though the excavations at Masada ended in 1965, the public life of the site escalated, and perhaps even embellished the historical reality. The Israeli Defense Forces began taking their national oath atop the ancient mountain fortress, and a nation swore that Masada should never fall again. But scholars today find the archaeological record is not in such perfect accord with the story of Josephus. Murmurs of doubt about the mass suicide at Masada circulated. Why were there 11 shards bearing personal names when the historian Josephus had reported 10? And why had only 3 skeletons been found in the northern palace, where Josephus had reported that the mass suicide of all 960 had taken place there.
While Josephus described that there were 960 zealots on the summit of Masada and took their own lives, Yadin found only a little more than 24. The fact that the bodies found in the cave on the southern side of the mountain, those given a military funeral in 1969, were, as Yadin himself publicly admitted, mixed with the bones of pigs, makes their identification with the zealots, who were extremely particular about the observance of Jewish law, at least problematic.
And what are the famous shards with the names of the defenders on them?
The 11 inscribed potsherds that Yadin suggested might have been the very lots cast by the last 10 zealots before their suicide are also problematic, in that hundreds, if not thousands, of inscribed potsherds were found over the surface of the mound. And in fact, inscribed potsherds seem to have been the method by which the zealots distributed food.
According to the Roman historian Josephus, not all of the zealots died at the top of the rock of Masada. 5 women and children hid in a water duct from the slaughter and lived to relate the horrifying final hours. They told Josephus of the magnificent speech given by the garrison commander Eleazar ben Yair after the Romans had broken through the fortress walls and defeat was imminent, convincing the rebels to choose death over capture. Scholars began to question the historical truth of Josephus.
Besides a number of improbabilities in the story itself, such as how the women and children who were hiding in a water cistern could have repeated verbatim the text of Eliezer ben Yair's suicide speech, I think that it's fairly clear by now that Josephus, like many classical authors, was giving a melodramatic ending to a great epic. The theme of suicide as a heroic ending for classical histories was common to people throughout the Greek and Roman worlds. In that, Josephus was really doing nothing new, but giving an accepted end to his literary tale.
Their reinterpretation of the Masada story would touch off a controversy about the famous mass suicide and add to a growing consternation about the place of the Masada myth in a nation's self-definition. Colonel Meir Payel is Israel's leading military historian.
The pattern was more or less like this, that the men killed their wives and children. Then they elected 10 people to kill the other ones, the other men there. And then the last 10 ones, elected one of them to kill the other 9. And the only one who committed suicide was the last one. So it should not be considered as a suicide. But it was really, I won't say a massacre, it was a slaughter.
As far as what really happened at Masada, there's no question that there was a slaughter and a brutal, bloody defeat. But what probably happened in the last moments of Masada was more chaos than suicide. Certainly, some may have committed suicide. Others were killed, yet others taken into slavery. To assume that Josephus' story is literally correct is to misunderstand what he was trying to say. And it's even more ironic that even for a time, an entire nation would take what was a melodramatic ending for a national ideal.
The theory that the mass suicide of Masada was nothing more than a literary cliché has gotten a mixed reception among the original excavators of the site.
It is a true story. It is a true story which we hear about from Josephus Flavius. We believe Josephus Flavius in everything he did. We discovered in Masada every possible physical proof to what Josephus Flavius says.
There's no way we can prove one way or the other. So, for those of us who want to believe the story verbatim, that this is what happened, they committed suicide. For others, they were killed when the roof collapsed on their heads. One way or the other, these are the last defenders of Masada. And that's the big thing. It doesn't matter if the story of Josephus is 100% so. Some of us need it to be exactly so. I don't think it's really important.
Well, it is not a myth, because after all, I mean, the thing happened. The question is, what was the significance for the history of this country, for the people of Israel?
Every archaeologist is, in a sense, a myth maker, contributing by his discoveries to the creation of a shared national story of the past.
This is where myth gets fused with politics. But Neil Silberman thinks that the world of archaeology is never immune to the power of political myth. For him, Masada is a cautionary tale.
I think the danger of a huge project like Masada, so focused in, so entirely devoted in the public mind to a single historical incident, is that archaeologists can lose control of its political significance to politicians and other leaders who have very different agendas and different objectives to use the past.
And for some, even the act of suicide is inappropriate as a symbol of national pride.
And according to Jewish tradition, usually we would prefer life to death, even if you are doomed to be a slave.
You fight if there is no choice. If you stand with your back to the wall, you fight until you fight for whatever it is you believe in, and if you need to die, you die. But this is not an ideal, to die for one's country. The ideal is to live for one's country.
Cheryl Spivak came from California to find she had a different feeling about the story of Masada once she walked in these ruins.
There's, to my mind, a prevailing sense of sadness here, of loss. People killing their children bothered me a great deal. Masada, in some ways, is a sign of failure, of giving up, of bowing to the inevitable catastrophes that happen in life and giving in to them.
I thought once that Masada should be developed as a myth in order to, create bravery within our forces. But now, following the Six-Day War, I think that Masada is obsolete.
Colonel Meyer Payel, in charge of training young army recruits at the time, has gone through something of a change of heart about the use of Masada for national purposes.
Let's put it this way. Our educational and political authorities, maybe even military authorities, they use it for two different sakes. The first one is to try to educate the army to be brave and fight till the death, etc. Basically, which I don't accept because I don't consider this a real, symptom of bravery. And the other intention is to demonstrate to the Jewish people in Israel I would say, the negative outcome of a disaster, of a total disaster, out of which we should learn what should we do in order to avoid another Masada. But about 20 years ago, we started a reassessment and we changed it. Now basically you won't find an Israeli unit who would come there and swear an oath, to take an oath there.
At the time of the excavations, Masada provided a metaphor of heroic self-sacrifice for a modern nation under siege. But in a land where myth and history intermingle freely, many now question the wisdom of defining a national consciousness through a tale of zealotry and suicide.
We should face Masada as it was, and I think that from the point of view of culture and morale and humanistic and Jewish tradition, we should deny Masada.
other city has inspired such passions. Jerusalem. Her ancient walls have seen so much. Pilgrims coming from all over the world. Jews mourning past outrages in prayers before stones quarried 2,000 years ago for Herod. Muslims visiting the site of Muhammad's ascension on a hill remembered by Jews for Abraham's sacrifice. Winding past sacred monuments are streets filled with mystery. The passers-by are a polyglot of creeds and cultures. For the moment, they coexist, yet Jerusalem is a city wearied by war. Visitors are drawn to the nearby town of Bethlehem. There, commercial banners proclaim the birthplace of the Prince of Peace. From that time to this, Bethlehem has been a trading place for nomads from Judea. In 1947, one of these nomads found his way to a small shop, hoping to sell a rotting parchment he'd found in the desert. The desert beyond Bethlehem is Judea. Green things are rare in the land of the prophets, but a spring emerges from the mountains at a place called Ein Feshka. For as long as history has been recorded here, fresh water has flowed, nourishing vegetation and refreshing wayfarers. In recent times, Ein Feshka was Arab territory, part of the Kingdom of Jordan. In the Six-Day War, Israel pushed Jordan out of Jerusalem, out of Bethlehem, and out of Judea. Now, the Israelis hold the entire west bank of the Jordan River and Dead Sea. Israel's 1967 Blitzkrieg was intended to push Arab forces back to the east bank of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, thus giving the tiny Jewish state a defensible border with its hostile neighbors. The West Bank is hostile enough without the thunder of competing armies. It is hot and dry and mountainous. The greenery and cool breezes of Jerusalem are only a short drive away, but they might as well be on the other side of the moon. Nowhere is the harsh reality of life on the West Bank more apparent than at an ancient mountain sanctuary 30 miles south of the spring at Ein Feshka. Today, cable cars make the journey to the top an easy one. In the time of Rome's dominion over the Hebrews, the trip meant climbing a trail called the Snake. By whatever route to the top, one encounters an astonishing monument to the human struggle for freedom. The place is Masada. 2,000 years ago, a people called the Zealots lived here. They looked at the corrupt world below and felt safe. Masada was the largest of the West Bank settlements maintained by religious patriots in defiance of Roman authority. On their mountaintop, the Zealots even had room to grow livestock and crops. From their lookouts, they could see the other side of the Dead Sea and watch invasion routes from the north. An elaborate complex of reservoirs was cut into the mountain to store runoff from rare winter rains, enough to quench Masada's thirst all summer. No enemy could approach the walls of the city without being seen. The Zealots were prepared for just about everything. But they had not anticipated the tenacity of the Roman legion. The army was marching south from Jerusalem. Rome was expanding the frontiers of empire. The legionnaires brought engines of war. They were prepared for a long siege. From the summit of Masada, it is still possible to see the outlines of the Roman encampments below. The battle raged 3 years. By then, the Zealots knew the end was near. They drew lots to implement a desperate plan. The Zealots had chosen death by their own hands rather than surrender. The man chosen by Lot to see the deed done had fallen on his own sword. The Zealots might have been hardened in their resolve by news of what had happened at Qumran. Like Masada, Qumran was a community of devout Jews who sought refuge from oppression and immorality. Their settlement lay in the Romans' line of march from Jerusalem to Masada. Qumran was much smaller, with none of Masada's formidable defenses. Its people were more disposed to prayer than politics or war. The Romans crushed them and moved on. For perhaps 200 years, the Qumran sect had struggled for survival in the desert. They had dug a canal to carry rainwater from reservoirs in the mountains. The canal led to an elaborate system of channels inside the settlement. These, in turn, fed a network of smaller channels which emptied into large and small cisterns. Use of the precious fluid, both for ceremony and survival, was decided in council debate. Debates took place in a large hall. Only full initiates could speak. Ritual cleansing in special pools was part of an initiation process which might take several years. It was the only way to become a participant in community life. If the new member was favored, he might gain access to another part of the settlement. In a small room facing the sea, Qumran's most important work was done. Here, scribes bent over plaster benches, copying holy scriptures, their work illuminated by a window open to the sky. In another room, potters worked to prepare the jars which would hold the scrolls. Others tanned hides for parchment. Work came to an abrupt halt in the spring of 31 BC. The Roman historian Josephus marks this as the time of a terrible earthquake. Major damage, which might have been caused by that quake, is evident at Qumran. Did the community then scatter to the hills? Open graves at the walls of Qumran may be evidence of the heavy price exacted by nature. New construction on the site of cleared wreckage indicates the settlement slowly came back to life. The dedication of the community was not to be thwarted by a catastrophe of God's making. Perhaps the Qumran settlers felt their faith was being tested. When the final crisis came, the people of Qumran would be ready. The flocks of goats and sheep grazing on the hills between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea belonged to nomadic desert Arabs called Bedouin. They are a clannish people, hardened to life in the wilderness. Few outsiders ever get close to them. Since the 17th century, the Ta'amira tribe has eked out a living near the banks of the Dead Sea. The terrain is harsh, and tending the livestock is hard work. On a hot summer's day in 1947, a young Ta'amira goat herd went chasing a stray. His name was Muhammad Adib, and he was about to make history. 2,000 years before Muhammad, others had followed the same path into the wilderness. The young Bedouin, who couldn't read and knew nothing of history, was walking in the footsteps of scholars who had devoted their lives to preserving the past. The adventure Muhammad was embarked on would soon vindicate their labors. Cool blackness had caught the boy's eye. It was a cave. Playfully, Muhammad dropped a stone. He had found the hiding place of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
When the news of the discovery reached me in Jerusalem, I was a fellow of the American School of Oriental Research in the year 1947-48. On February 15th, a few days before,
Professor John Trevor was the first scholar to see Muhammad's discovery, as agents for the Bedouin quietly sought to determine its worth.
It was Wednesday, the 18th of February, when the Syrians called to the American school to get some information about some manuscripts that they had. I was amazed by their description. It didn't make too much sense to me. So I said, well, the only way I can give you information is to see the documents. So they agreed to come over the next afternoon. And when they arrived, they had a satchel with 5 documents wrapped in Arabic newspaper. They handed me one very small one, and I tried to open it, and it was very brittle. Before I had a chance to do more than simply notice it was in Hebrew, then they drew my attention to this large scroll. And when I began to look at what was before me, I was puzzled. And immediately when I began to compare this script with the Nash Papyrus, I saw evidences of great antiquity. The Nash Papyrus had been dated in the 2nd century, 1st century BC. And I thought to myself, well, perhaps then this could be as old as the Nash Papyrus, which would make it 1,000 years older than the oldest known biblical manuscript in Hebrew. But then I suddenly realized that I had not checked the manuscript for authenticity. Could it be a forgery, was the question that plagued me all that night. So the next morning I made arrangements to get into the old city and go to the monastery. And then they brought out the scroll again, and I began to unroll it very carefully, looking for evidences of corrections, particularly that might give an indication of authenticity. And I finally came to column 33, and there suddenly was the evidence that I was looking for. For here on this column are 2 corrections made by 2 different hands, and no forger could possibly have produced the phenomenon of those corrections. Then I knew that I was looking at a manuscript that was 2,000 years old, the oldest biblical manuscript yet discovered.
News of the discovery touched off a stampede. Jordanian authorities called on the famed desert police for help. The Bedouin weren't about to tell anyone where the cave was. It would be up to the police to find it before more scrolls got into the wrong hands, and bidding climbed too high for scholars to compete with private collectors. In time, the police succeeded. They found not one cave, but a virtual honeycomb in the hills behind Qumran. The Bedouin, however, had found them first. They were picked clean. No one could be sure how many of the caves had actually contained anything of value. Scroll hunting had become the full-time occupation of the Ta'amira tribe. Every likely crevice was explored. The Bedouin had approached the task with the same cunning that had made them successful smugglers and highwaymen. Clearly, the only choice authorities had was to deal with the Bedouin. Government archaeologist Joseph Saad checked into the Winter Palace Hotel in Jericho, posing as an agent for a wealthy collector. There, Saad met secretly with his superior to fix the price they were willing to pay. They settled on a maximum fee of £1 per square centimeter of scroll fragment. Negotiations were set to take place in a rundown hotel on the other side of town. Representing the Bedouin was a Bethlehem merchant named Kando. It was to him that Muhammad had brought the first scrolls. Eventually, the bargain was made. Although neither side really trusted the other, a relationship now existed that could enable scholars to unravel the mystery of the scrolls. Kando and his young Bedouin friend Muhammad even traveled to Amman, Jordan to dine with the director of antiquities. There, for the first time, officials heard the full story of the amazing discovery. By now, experts had a much clearer understanding of the importance of the scrolls. Basically, the scrolls provide a 2,000-year-old verification of the accuracy of the Old Testament as known to modern men. The uniformity of the versions was astonishing. In 1952, another amazing discovery was made. 2 rolled strips of copper were found near Qumran. When cut apart, they revealed an inventory of buried treasure. The wealth represented in the list was enormous. Gold and silver bullion, huge quantities of coins and sacred artifacts. Could this be the treasure of Jerusalem, lost in the Roman attack of 70 AD? If it is, the Jews must have hidden the wealth in secret places throughout the city. What has become of the treasure? Why would the list be hidden at Qumran? The ruins are mute. Clearly, however, the settlement was recognized in its own day as far more important than the size of its membership would suggest. Some scholars believe John the Baptist lived here as a boy, watching the scribes work at their writing tables. Jesus was certainly at least aware of the community and of the scripture being copied and sealed away in the large clay jars unique to Qumran, time capsules to be opened in a distant age. From the other writings of the sect, we know that the community believed it was living in the last days before God's judgment, the ultimate triumph of light over darkness. Even as they labored to accumulate and preserve the Jewish scriptures, they prepared for the final struggle with the forces of evil and the new age to come. In this way, the Qumran settlers anticipated the apocalypse. When it came, they were unprepared for the result.
The Qumran community continued for over 200 years to live here in this site with that daily expectation that the new age was about to begin and they would be involved. But instead, exactly the opposite happened. Instead of there being the sons of light who would destroy or defeat the sons of darkness came down in the form of the Roman Vespasian army and defeated the sons of light.
The written contributions of Qumran live on in Jerusalem's shrine of the book. Qumran's spirit is alive too. Many of today's Jews are following the traditions established there so long ago. All who value faith are in some way indebted to the people who labored in the desert to preserve it. Qumran was destroyed and its inhabitants put to the sword. Perhaps, however, the ultimate victory they prayed for was theirs after all. We know that the Essenes sent emissaries to Masada when they saw the end was near for Qumran. Perhaps they sent them elsewhere. The map will give us a clue. The east bank of the Jordan and Dead Sea is in many ways a mirror image of the west. For Jerusalem, there's Amman. For Eilat, there is Aqaba. Why should the Essene and Zealots not have established settlements on the east bank also? The political boundaries of today meant nothing then. The east bank has been untouched by archaeologists. What treasures may lie in these hills? Qumran was created to rise above the corruption and violence of its age. Peace has not yet come to the west bank of the Dead Sea. If it ever does, perhaps men can concentrate on finding more of the treasures Qumran left behind.